Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Over the last couple of weeks, as we mentioned in the last podcast, we've been working on a program called INFx Empowered, which is a program designed for INFJs and INFPs to deal with some of the biggest challenges that those of you who are INFJs and INFPs reported experiencing. And there were quite a few subjects that came up that just for Joel and I sort of struck us as really good insights and new ways of seeing things, or just maybe a subject that we hadn't put like things in a subject that we hadn't put language to yet, or challenges that we are working on overcoming, and maybe we're at the 5-yard line and then just needed a little bit of language and then we made it all the way. And one of those things was this idea of judgment. Now, judgment is not just an INFJ or an INFP challenge. Judgment is a human challenge. We're all social creatures. We all have a tendency to hand our power over to the collective in some way. And that's because we should care about other people's opinions. We really should. We're social creatures. We're part of a much bigger group than just us as individuals. In that sort of John Donne, no man is an island way, or Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is trying to get the balance or the tension between how much you're caring about the subject yourself and the object or other people. So there's a balance or a tension that needs to be kept when you're talking about how much you're handing over to the collective in terms of power or judgment or care and concern. We talked a little bit about this in the image management podcast, but I think on the other side, that's about your relationship to the collective. Judgment is a fear of the collective's relationship to you. It's this fear that other people are giving you a sense of criticism for your choices, who you are, the things that make up who and what and who and what you are and how you show up. And then the idea of having that stop you from taking action. That's something that I think all of us wrestle with to some extent, because we know we're supposed to care, but how much are we supposed to care? And how much of that judgment are we supposed to take on for ourselves?
I have struggled massively with judgment in my life, personally. And I think there's two parts to how I've felt judged in my life over the course of my life. One area is I felt judged for who I am. The person that is me, maybe my personality type, how I show up, how I see the world, and the parts of who Joel is. And then there's another part of what I do that feels judged. And maybe this is a very introverted feeling experience for me, but I don't really care people judging me for what I do. It doesn't bother me. I really haven't cared about it. The only reason I would care is if it would lead to resource or support being taken away from me. That's the only thing I care about, people judging me for what I do. That's the only quote unquote punishment I could see coming from it. Making me feel bad or trying to shame me. I don't give two craps about that. It's about, if they make me feel bad or shame me, it's more about who I am that would feel bad about that, not about what I've done. So again, I think that's a very introverted feeling perspective. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. Definitely about who I am, and my faith background taught me that I wasn't bad and wrong for the things I've done. Everybody does bad things. That's not why you're bad and wrong. It's because you're born into sin. You are born an enemy of God. You're bad and wrong for who you are, not for what you've done. And they try to kind of make it sound like it's what you've done, quote unquote, because you had no other choice because of who you are, because it keeps coming back to who you are, right? So I had to do a lot of work through that, because that's where the judgment for me lived. I would say that each of us probably has one of those placements of judgment that we tend to value over the other. You probably value what you do, being judged about that, more than maybe who you are, or maybe who you are more than what you do. And there's a relationship to both of those. But I think that is where the first thing we can do here is try to parse that out and see what you're feeling judgment around.
Well, I think you're onto something here, because you mentioned, as somebody who uses introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, the judgment about who you are strikes you the hardest. And on the other side of the polarity of introverted feeling is extroverted thinking or effectiveness, and that's what you're doing, right? It's the impact you're making in the world through your behaviors and activities. And I would imagine that somebody who's a TJ would probably be more sensitive to that feedback or that criticism. And I would say there's another layer here because I'm on the introverted thinking, accuracy, extroverted feeling, harmony polarity. And so I think about it very differently.
Yeah, I was going to say, I never think about being judged for my thoughts or my beliefs.
Well, it's actually more about what you're saying.
Yeah.
And whether or not you're being cruel, right? Because the idea of not being part of the extroverted feeling or harmony collective, which means that, like I may or may not follow the unspoken social contracts of a room, right? They only do them if they make sense to me. And I don't really care about being judged for that. I do, however, care about being judged for being, for lacking compassion or being somebody who's cruel, particularly when I say something that is, in my opinion, either a truth that my introverted thinking or accuracy believes and wants to share, or if it's just like an absurd throwaway thing that wasn't really intended to be taken seriously, and yet people still give the feedback that it was like harmful or hurtful to somebody else. It's really hard for me in a world that, acts like the word triggered has come up into the collective unconscious in the last 5 to 10 years. And it might have become one of my least favorite words, even though it's an incredibly useful word. So useful. But in a world where things are so easily triggering, my introverted thinking or accuracy feels particularly judged in this world. This idea that you can't say the things that are true for you, or that you can't say the things that you're working out, which, we've talked about in previous podcasts about introverted thinking. So we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But it's about what strikes you when you're being judged. And I would imagine there's probably a lot of corollary with what our judging functions are, because that's how we think the world should be, right? That's the shouldness of the world in our minds is based on our judging or evaluative functions. And so when somebody gives us feedback that has us question those and, sort of undermines our own opinion of ourselves in those contexts, that's probably the thing that we take, those are the hits we take the hardest.
I've watched you in the last, many years. You have extroverted feeling. That harmony process is your 10-year-old tertiary process. And people that have harmony or extroverted feeling higher in their stack, IFJs and EFJs, they have this nuance of kind of understanding the social rules, what you can joke about, what you can't, when it's appropriate, when it's not. I certainly don't understand it. Sometimes it's baffling to me because in one context, a joke can be said and everybody laughs. In another context, the exact same thing can be said and everybody's like outraged. And I'm like, what is it's so weird to me, the rules here. Like
something said at a wedding or a funeral changes it.
I mean, that's an oversimplified way of seeing it, but yeah, kind of. And I've seen you do this, like you watch a harmony person or an extroverted feeling person joke about something, maybe like a baby or something, like look how cute that, and you make some comment about the baby. And I watch it too, and I catalog it, and you catalog it, and then you will go and attempt to make a very similar joke in a seemingly similar context, and then someone's offended by that, and you're kind of confused. You're like, I thought I'm doing the FE thing. We're supposed to like joke about this. I just watched an FE do this yesterday. What is going on? Like, why is extroverted feeling, what is happening here? And it's kind of confusing, I think.
Yeah, well, I imbue too much of my introverted thinking into that.
Is that what it is?
Extroverted feeling moment. Like, okay. I just can't, the nature of me can't stop it. And so
Sneaking it in there.
Well, it's not even as sneaking. It's just like it's an intrinsic part of who I am. So it just ends up showing up there. And that can come back to haunt me because I'm not doing it right. You know what I mean? Like, I'm close, but not quite there. And actually, I had an example of this recently where we sent an email out for this promotion for this new program.
Oh, yeah.
And I said something in one of the emails that was intended to be sort of this throwaway sort of, girl.
Build rapport, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was it was basically an assumption of intimacy with our audience. And I think that was probably a mistake to assume intimacy. But I feel a sense of intimacy. And I think that a lot of, especially our podcast listeners, feel a sense of intimacy too. Because, we're in your mind grapes. Like right now, you're probably listening to us with your headphones on. That's a very deeply, like, we're echoing in your brain right now. That's a really intimate space.
We're in your head.
That's right. We're in your mind fuzz. So it's this sense of intimacy that I feel assumptive about. And so I wrote in one of these promotional emails, I wrote about some of the challenges INFs deal with. And then I just said, kids, you're a mess. And I said it in a very extroverted feeling sort of way. Like I've sat at the table with a bunch of women and, with margaritas, and they're just like, "Girl, you're a mess," right? And I go, "Oh, that's how you talk to people, right? You kind of go, you're a mess." And then we got this email back, not a ton, but a couple emails where people were like, "You can take your program and shove it." Because I was calling them a mess, right? And they didn't need that. They didn't need that harshness from me.
Well, probably felt judged. That person
Yes.
probably, I mean, we're talking about judgment. They probably felt like you were judging them,
Absolutely.
not trying to build rapport.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key thing that one of the key elements I got out of creating this program about judgment is that one of the council members said they were quoting Jiddu Krishnamurti, who, if you're not familiar with Jiddu Krishnamurti, he's the one that very famously quoted, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." That's one of his most famous quotes. But the guy is filled with wisdom. So my high recommendation is that you go check out his work. I mean, he's, of course, long since passed away, but he was brilliant. And she was quoting Krishnamurti by saying that judgment is a knife. And by that, it's not that it stabs, it's that it cuts. It cuts connection between people. So judgment cuts off your connection between two people. It's basically cutting rapport, right? It's getting you out of a place where you're feeling an energetic flow back and forth. And that's one of the reasons why judgment is so harsh. And I think particularly impacts people who use extroverted feeling or harmony in a way that can be debilitating because they don't like the cutting of connection. And if connection is one of the number one things that you're using as a gauge of the temperature of how well things are going, then anything that causes that cut of connection is going to feel painful to you. And I think with introverted feeling, so the judgment piece with anybody who's using extroverted feeling, that would be any of us that are FJs or TPs. The judgment we're experiencing it's a loneliness. When we get judged, we feel lonely. It's like it sucks the connective oxygen out of the room. For introverted feeling or authenticity, which would be anybody who's an FP or a TJ in the Myers-Briggs system, somebody like you, they might feel judged for, like you said, who they are as a person. Like there's something intrinsically wrong about you. And that has got to be a very painful experience to be judged for, like, basically the soul version of your skeletal structure. What are you supposed to do about it? You can't do anything about it. It's who you are. And so feeling judged about that probably also feels incredibly lonely. So no matter who you are, judgment's results is a sense of loneliness. And I think that this idea that judgment is a knife also extends to a cutting of connection with oneself. Annie, who was the council member who quoted Krishnamurti in this, said that you have to, in order for judgment to impact you, you have to swallow the knife, meaning that you have to integrate it within you. And you have to accept the judgment and let it do all its cutting all the way down. Like you swallow it and now it's cutting you all the way internally. It's causing disconnection with the self. It's causing a sense of sort of not indecision, but more like it's an undermining energy for who you are and how you feel about yourself. So with judgment, one of the keys is to not swallow the knife. Understanding that the result of judgment is very painful. And I think almost, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Like this sense of, oh God, I'm being judged is almost the worst it's a worse feeling than actually being judged, if that makes sense. Because a lot of times the thing that we fear we're being judged about is not true. It's not even happening from the outside world. It's that they presented something that we thought was a knife and we preemptively swallowed it, and now we're judging ourselves. And that's the disconnect. And so then we get mad at the outside world for causing a split within ourselves, by causing an undermining energy with our relationship with who we are and our ability to have self-esteem, or at least it feels like they just cut off our ability or a relationship with our own self-esteem. But the reality is that we took the knife from them and we swallowed it.
I remember a friend of ours joking with me years ago about some joke I said. I mean, this was like back in like my 30s, like my early 30s, joking about how I was doing dad jokes. I remember just being like, okay, whatever, and shrugged it off. And then recently, within the last year, someone joked about me making a dad joke, and it really affected me. Because I'm getting older and I'm walking through the world going, man, I'm getting older. Am I all washed up? Do I have any virility to my life? Am I an old man now, just a dad that doesn't have anything to bring society? I have that self-talk sometimes. So certain things about telling dad jokes now affect me, and 10 years ago they didn't. It's so weird to see how that kind of thing I've noticed that in my life. The things that I worry about as I move through life, like how I show up to the world, if I'm not worried about it and someone says something, I just shrug. It doesn't bother me at all. But if I'm worried about it, it's almost like it was like somebody plunged a knife into my heart half the time. And I totally feel it fully, the weight of it, all of it. And I think I've realized that's me, not the other person. They're just a mirror reflecting the things, the insecurities I'm carrying through my life. They're just reflecting back to me. And that is I think it's a big awareness just in that, like what you're talking about with Annie talked about in Krishnamurti's quote of swallowing the knife is and she even says in the program, she's like, she's very skinny. And she's like, if somebody said I was really overweight, I would just it wouldn't bother me because that's not something I struggle with, insecurity, right? But if they talk maybe about how skinny she is, that might bother her, that kind of thing. So it's these insecurities we carry that judgment hits against. And I think that's a really important awareness for all of us to realize that most of the time it's self-judgment that's coming in here. It really is the self that's judging, and then they're just giving you a reason to judge yourself yet again.
I think I've realized that judgment, at least for me, and I suspect this works for everybody, but I don't know it, so I'm just gonna own it for me. That judgment is a way of thinking. It's habituated. Judgment is habituated. And when we are habituated within our own neural pathways to be judgmental, then when somebody else is saying something that feels like it's similar to our judgmental neural pathways, it immediately triggers those pathways. It's like an autoresponder in our head. All the neural pathways are set up for judgment. Now we kind of talked about this idea of being judged or judgment versus the judging functions. And so judgment in and of itself is not bad. Judgment simply means evaluation, and all of us have to do it. So we're not saying, or at least I'm not trying to imply here, that judgment is something that you have to let go of and it's stop making it a way of thinking. It's that the undermining energy of judgment that cuts relationship off between you and your self-esteem. That's also a neural pathway. That's that's a whole collective, a matrix inside your mind of a way of thinking. And when you have all of those neural pathways set up, your brain goes into autopilot. And as soon as somebody hits one of those nodes, right, any of the nodes that would be even sort of in that neural pathway, all of a sudden the whole neural pathway is triggered. And now you're thinking in these terms. It's a habituated neural pathway. And the more you start digging those neural pathways up, because remember, neural pathways, your brain, especially if you have these thought processes a lot, the brain goes, this must be a really important thought process. And because it wants to be as nimble and as efficient as possible, it just goes, okay, well, this is a neural pathway that is being activated over and over and over again, so it's a really important one. So let's just put a little myelin on top of it. Let's just put a layer of fat over it to protect it and keep it going. So the work of deprogramming yourself from neural pathways is not necessarily easy. Even on a physical level, it takes some effort for the brain to do it. But because it's habituated, we don't know that the brain has given it priority, not because of its importance or its validity or truth. It's given it priority because of its frequency of use. And that's how the brain works. Like, it prioritizes based on how often you think this thought and how many other thoughts this thought is connected to, and that whole neurons that fire together, wire together. So if these neural pathways are connected to a bunch of other ones, the brain goes, well, this is a really important one. It's all it's all part of this ecosystem, so let's protect those. And if we habituate the kind of judgment, not evaluation, not a general evaluation that helps us make decisions in life, but the kind of judgment that undermines one's relationship to one's own self-esteem, and the brain has this whole system, a mechanism of protection around it, and anytime any of those nodes get triggered, it lights the whole thing up, and now we're feeling bad about who we are, then it really doesn't take much for us to hand our power over to the outside world, because we're just waiting for them to trigger just part of that in order for the whole collection to go, okay, let's run this simulation again, let's run this program again. And so you really have swallowed the knife. Like the knife might as well have been the thing that cut their neural pathways into your brain, right? Like kind of like cutting a line in the dirt, right? It forged it, and you just keep swallowing the knife, and the knife just keeps going in there and like forging this path. And the second you stop swallowing the knife, you stop habituating this way of thinking, then it doesn't matter what another person says. There's no neural pathway to light up because you just stopped habituating those thoughts. You stop thinking those thoughts. And generally, when somebody feels the sting of being judged, then we have a tendency to do reciprocity. We feel the sting of being judged so often that the only countermeasure we feel like we have is to judge others as a protective mechanism, as almost like a projection of the pain we're experiencing to push it outward so that we're not the only one that's experiencing it. Particularly speaking from the perspective of somebody using extroverted feeling or harmony like I am, then we get to keep the connection going. Even though the connection is based on something awful, like the undermining energy of cutting your relationship with your self-esteem, we're all in this together, right? And so we get to maintain our connection. We all loathe ourselves together. That's connective,
well,
right?
It's certainly codependent.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But that's connection, right? Codependence is connection. And so there's a tendency for people using extroverted feeling to kind of go down this road. And the solution generally is to, well, it happens in tandem. So which one starts first is up to the individual. But both the judgment of the self, that needs a pattern interrupt, and the judgment of others as a projection to be able to deal with the pain of the self-judgment also needs a pattern interrupt. So both of those things need pattern interrupts to stop doing this dance of judgment. And when you pull back on this judgment, when you stop trying to form connections with others through self-deprecation, we're all in this together mentality. When you decide that it's better to be lonely in high self-esteem than to be in a collective of people who hate themselves, and you're willing to do that, because the fear, of course, is the loneliness. The fear is that the knife will cut the connection and you'll be lonely. And so then the codependence starts by keeping connection. But if you make peace with loneliness, if you make peace with this idea of being with oneself and then building one's own self-esteem up, then there's no longer a weapon to be used against you, because the worst thing happened. The worst thing, which was the lack of connection in the beginning. That's already happened now. So now you can just be there with yourself and building your self-esteem. And then, of course, what happens next? You find other people with high self-esteem and you start hanging out with them, and everybody's just super happy to be connected to each other in high self-esteem as opposed to connected in self-deprecation.
So I'm working on a thought of the purpose of judgment, because obviously we pull upon it in ourselves for something we think it's doing for us. So I'm going to work out this thought here as my extroverted intuition attempts to. So kind of, I think of it in two ways. One could be that we're using it as a survival tactic to say, I'm dependent on other people liking me, so I have to be judgmental of myself and take their criticism of myself in order to be in alignment with those people. So I have a survival strategy, because we're social creatures. So on the primal part of our brain, we're wanting to not offend anyone. And I guess, and then the second part, the thought I had also is we're attempting to, by judging ourselves, point out the pimple on our face before someone else can point it out on our face. And it gives us a synthetic sense of control or power in a very chaotic world. And those things might be separate or related. I haven't really worked that out in my head yet. But these seem to be what the benefit of judging ourselves is I get a synthetic feeling of more power or control, because I'm the one calling out the flaw. You're not. I already called it myself first. I've seen people be like, no one's harder on themselves than me. I'm the hardest on myself than anyone could ever be toward myself. Like I'm my biggest critic. And it's almost like this pride, someone might say. And I think it's that control of, I don't have to be beholden to somebody pointing out something on me or in me that I haven't already thought about. So I feel more like synthetic sense of power. And then I think that's a survival strategy. I think it's because we realize that we are social creatures. Truly, no one really lives in isolation. I mean, there's a few people that are able to do it, like true in the woods, in a cabin, by themselves, no humanity at all, It's very, very rare, though. Most of us want to be connected to somebody and have people in our lives that we are social with. And I think it's a protection, almost like a nervous protection of I don't want to make this bad because I want to keep that connection going.
Yeah, virtuizing self-deprecation.
Yeah.
Yeah, like making it so that it's a virtue to beat yourself up all the time. And
well, is that why you judge yourself, do you think? For survival reasons?
oh, definitely. Well, everything. Well, okay. So
everything's survival reasons.
I feel everything's or the emergent of a system that was helping us survive. And I think this idea of virtuizing beating yourself up, which is a signal of humility, right? We hope it's a signal of humility, but really it's false humility. Beating yourself up all the time is not true humility. It's that you think you're so special that you should be held to a higher standard than everybody else, and you're failing, so you beat yourself up for it. It's actually a sign of ego. And I think the challenge here in this social construct that we're in, like we are social creatures, we hang out with other people, we want to connect, we want to be in their energetic interchange. And we live in this three-dimensional reality of surfaces, right? Like basically the three-dimensional world is a world of surfaces. And so we get really seduced by surfaces. We get really seduced by how things look and the image of them and how they how we're impressed by them based on on how our two-dimensional how we're perceiving it in our eyes and how our brain is interpreting it. And so we do that with people too, which is why we judge books by covers, metaphorically when it comes to humans, because we see their surface. And so if we can get really good at surface tricks, right, sort of like making our surface look as good as possible, then we can fool most of the people most of the time. And this idea of self-deprecation, which is, I agree, controlling the message, right? If I tell you that I noticed the pimple on my nose first, then I at least am self-aware about it and that it wasn't from neglect. So I get to, going back to the image management podcast, I get to manage your image and how you see me. I get to be in control of all of this. But when you stop looking at things on surface levels and you try to really connect with another person, those kinds of people are very difficult to create intimacy with because a lot of their real estate is going to the image piece in order to forge connection. And connection and intimacy, this has been a big aha for me. This actually came from the INTx program that we did a special workshop for like a month ago. This difference between intimacy and connection is pretty huge. And one of the things we talked about in that workshop was that our extroverted functions, all four of the extroverted functions, particularly the ones that we are most fond of in our car model or stack, that's how we build connection with the outside world, is our extroverted functions. But we build intimacy with our introverted functions because that's who we are inside. And getting a sneak peek of that with each other is how intimacy is forged. And so when we are really focused on connection and overvalue the connective piece, we have a tendency to not work as much on the building intimacy level. And so things like false humility work for connection, particularly if the other person is just on that surface three-dimensional reality level too, right? Just surface communication. But when you get to an intimacy level and you invite somebody inside and they see an image of flogging, right? If I go inside you and all I see is you flogging yourself, that's a disturbing image that I don't really want to be around very much. And so it's hard to be intimate and really come inside somebody else, like really get into those inner spaces when torture is happening. Like, I don't want to be around torture. I don't like torture in movies. I don't like torture in anything. Like, why would I want to see a human torture themselves? And so then you kind of back up and you go, I don't think I really want that. Particularly if you yourself are doing the same thing, because they're just mirroring back your own self-flagellation, your own torture that's happening inside, which is also very disturbing. So when we want to get beyond connection, when we want to get to true intimacy with somebody, when we get invited in, we want to see a more pleasant, peaceful Zen space. We're okay with the bad stuff, or at least I am when I'm forging intimacy with another person. I'm okay that there's bad stuff in there. That's part of what makes the person a real fleshed out, creature, like a human. That's part of humanity. But I don't want to watch them beating that part of them up. I want to watch them, like encouraging those parts, or, and to be better, or, working through those spaces to really understand them and process them and graduate from their hold on them. Like, I want to see a beautiful system inside. I don't want to see one of torture. I think that's the reason why swallowing the knife is such a great metaphor, because when you swallow those knives, you're giving the torturers within extra weapons to do self-harm. And you don't want to do that. Your inner parts, particularly the critical inner parts of you, don't need any more weapons. They've got plenty. What they need to do is lay their weapons down. They need to stop doing inner torture. And in that way, you might have less connection. You actually might. Like the email I sent out, the people who were upset with me, I'm not connected to them anymore. It was an attempt to build rapport and it failed with some people. And so I'm out of connection with them. But I'm not going to, I want for them to not swallow a knife that they believe I handed to them. And I'm not going to swallow the knife that they handed to me in some of the things they said.
Well, see, I interpret the response back. I would think atrophy or silence would be a break of connection. But a response of, you can take this program and shove it, to me, that is still connection. Like, at least I'm not an FE, I'm not an extroverted feeling user. So maybe you would interpret that differently on that polarity. But I look at that as, no, there's still connection going on. They're just upset about something.
Yeah, I do think that was a final statement attempting to break off. But maybe you're right. Maybe
it could have been a door slam. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? But basically, though, there was a sense that I was handing them a knife and then they were going to hand me one back. And the solution is to let go of the knives completely, to just let people let people believe whatever they want to believe about you, even if it's inaccurate. And especially if it is reflecting back to you some of your most secret insecurities, the things that are going on inside of you. When somebody else believes something that reminds you of the worst thing you believe about yourself, but you're constantly trying to run from it, that's the most judgment we feel, because that's the thing we don't want to look at. In some ways, their judgment of that, or our perception of their judgment, because a lot of times people aren't judging us. They're in their own shit. They don't care. They don't give two craps about us. Even the people who really love us are generally more in their own shit than they're in ours. But our perception of their judging us is a gift, because they're shining a light on something that probably needs to be addressed. Maybe it's a disassociated feeling, or maybe it's a part of us that is related to some trauma that we need to attend to. Like, getting triggered is maybe one of the best gifts a person can give you, because then you get this map for all this inner work. You get a compass and a map to show you what's going on for you. And then eventually, if you get good enough at all that excavating and all that spelunking inside of yourself using these maps and compasses, and you address all these parts that have trauma, I mean, it's not an easy ride by any stretch of the imagination, but you get to the ends of that ride basically untriggerable. You just can't be triggered anymore because you dealt with everything. Well, I mean, that's the goal, right? Fingers crossed. But you get to a point where you're less and less triggerable because people are not reflecting back things that need work. You've already done the work.
I think this idea of not caring what people think about me, or, well, here's the phrase I tell myself. It's none of my business what someone else thinks about me. It's none of my business what that other person over there thinks about who I am or what I do. None of my business. That's their business. That's their thought process. Just like it's none of their business what I think about them, quite frankly.
Which, by the way, I mean, I know I've done a ton of talking, so I want to make sure you get plenty of airtime here. I just want to say that you triggered for me a thought. There's a difference between I don't care and it's none of my business, right? Like as a parent, I know that there's a huge difference between those two things, because I'm always going to care about my children's decisions and choices, but I'm also going to know it's none of my business and I'm going to stay out of it.
Well, depending on their age. Our 7-year-old Piper, it's still my business.
Well, of course.
I get what you mean, though, principle-wise.
Increasing levels of empowering her.
I was like, wait a minute here. Which tries to, blow something up or do something disastrous.
I hope I didn't totally derail you. I apologize.
Oh, no, I don't remember exactly what I was going to say, but I appreciate that perspective. I think that's the thing that really helped me a lot, is that it's none of my business what somebody else, and that's hard. It's none of my business what someone else thinks of me is very hard to get to, because I want to know. I want to know what all these people think about me. We teach a lot on stage, or we do a lot of things, and you look out over an audience or a crowd as you're talking, and certain faces are smiling and nodding, and maybe like 90% or 95% are smiling and nodding, but maybe there's this stoic face in the audience, and that's where my attention goes. I'm like, what's that person thinking? Are they thinking bad things about what I'm saying or how I'm showing up, or do I have something on my face? Like, why aren't they responding with smiling and not, like it's this kind of like, the whole audience might be smiling and nodding, and this one person over here. And then I find out they're just like an INTJ or INTP, and that's just how they look, that kind of thing. So I'm like, oh, they're not mad. They're just an INT. But that's the kind of thing that we tend to really zoom in on, the negative aspects. Again, I think it goes back to that survival piece. And I think all of us do it a little different based on our personality. I think we all look for different markers. We look for different judgments based on who we are and how we're wired. I think that's definitely something to be thinking in terms of. There's double this. We have this self-judgment, and I think we also judge others. I think they're very related. Cheris, our chief of staff, just told me this story. She went to a wealth building seminar, and she was telling me about how they set up their workshop. She's telling me where they put the cameras and how because I'm always interested in how to run live events, because we're running more and more live events here at Personality Hackers. So I'm like, oh, what was it like? Where did they put the cameras? How was it? What was it like? And she said, it struck me, because she's used to coming to our events because she's helping us run them. It struck me how critical everybody was and judgmental they were about everything. And I said, really? Like what? She's like, the temperature of their tea and the fact they had to pay parking. And then I found out the guy paid like 70% of their parking for them, the guy who was running the event, but they were moaning and complaining they had to pay a little extra for parking. And it was a wealth building conference. Like a real estate investment conference or something. And the people were complaining about this and that, and they were getting started late, and every little thing people were moaning and complaining. She said it was really hard to be there. Like I was having trouble being there. This guy was really good-hearted. He seemed like he had positive intent and energy, but the audience he had pulled was so critical. I was having trouble interfacing with the crowd at all. And it reminded me that those judgments toward that guy in his workshop from those people, those were judgments of themselves. Those weren't judgments to that guy. And I kind of anchored that in the back of my head. Like, if we get judgments as we do things here, programs, podcasts, live events, personally, I realize, okay, that's not about us as much. I mean, we need feedback. We need to calibrate. But a lot of times when people are super critical, that's more about them than you. And we know that. That's a platitude. But I think this is really important to see that as we reflect, when I watch myself be judgmental, because I have a critical streak in me, I think we all do, I realize I'm probably saying more about myself than I am about that person or that thing that I'm judging out there. And that's something I've really come into realizing, is when I can let go of judgment, and it can go either way. If I can let go of judgment for the people out there, it improves my judgment for me in here. Or if I can let go of the judgment in here, it improves my judgment of people out there. They work in tandem for me. And I think it works in tandem for most people.
Routing it back to cognitive functions, I think that there is definitely something in here about the judging functions, particularly the extroverted judging function side of the polarity. That's the part of us that reaches out to try to figure out to take the temperature of what's happening out here and determine whether or not we're interfacing well with the outside world. And so if your judging polarity includes extroverted thinking or effectiveness, I think you said, well, I don't really care about what, somebody judging what I do as long as it doesn't interfere with my ability to get resource.
Yeah.
Well, then it does strike you, right? Because people's judgment might interfere with your ability to get resource. And are you still moving through the world 100% authentically if your opportunities are drying up? Of course not.
Yeah.
Right?
Once I know I can't be canceled and I've got everything in Bitcoin and no one can take my assets or my platforms, then I'll do whatever I want.
Right, exactly. Whereas anybody who has extroverted feeling or harmony as part of their polarity, again, the TPs and FJs, then it's going to be about their ability to be connected. It's going to be about their ability to be part of sort of the social matrix and to feel like they're not going to get booted from the tribe and that they're beloved, they're a valuable part of the ecosystem. And if they're not, they're going to, I'm going to pause in how I say things to ensure that the way that they're landing is well received. I'm not going to just introverted thinking or accuracy my way through everything. And if I do, I'm probably going to get my feelings hurt a lot because I'm going to get a lot of negative response back from the collective, which I care about because that's part of my polarity. I think the perceiving functions probably don't come in here as much. I think when we have miscommunication with our perceiving functions and other people, I think that's usually when we feel misunderstood, right? I don't know if our perceiving functions feel judged so much. Let's pretend that they live in a silo, that they operate in isolation from each other, which of course they don't, but let's pretend they did. The personification of each of the perceiving functions of intuition and sensing, then they, like those just when there's a cross communication there, when there's like a miscommunication, I think it just feels misunderstood. It's like, oh, I've got to try to get my point across better. I need to somehow communicate this better. But our judging functions, that's where we feel our hurt. And we go, oh, this must mean something, like not something conceptual, something personal. Like it must actually have like a sense of value wrapped up in all of it. So I think really getting into your judging function polarity and observing how you're walking through the world or operating through the world and how much you're letting the extroverted side of your polarity impact what you're doing. Now, of course, if you lead with an extroverted judging functions like all the EJs do, what I've noticed is that there's a flexibility that comes along with that because they know that they can't take every piece of feedback too seriously. Like, because they're getting so much of it and they're collating so much of it, there's almost a sense of flexibility. I think it's actually when it's an auxiliary function for IJs that it can sometimes be the most difficult to master. Or even as a tertiary or 10-year-old function, like with the EPs. I think IPs, when they lead with an introverted judging function, all the IPs do, I think they have a little bit easier time of just staying the course with that introverted function. But then it's like the extroverted part of them every once in a while pops up and it's almost like a repressed part of them that like suddenly makes itself known and then they get overwhelmed with it and they're not sure what to do. So I think just kind of understanding that the extroverted judging part of you is how you're going to create connection, looking at it through the lens of judgment and being judged and feeling judged. The extroverted part is how you maintain connection to the outside world, but the introverted part is how you experience intimacy. And so both of those things need to be attended to. They both need to be addressed, and there should be a balance, not necessarily of their strength, because of course the strength of how much you use that function is going to inform, like whether or not it's a better tool to be used. But I think understanding that everybody needs both. And so if you're overvaluing the feedback you get from the outside world to a point where you're now integrating it as a part of your identity in your introverted function, particularly negative feedback that the knives you're swallowing, that's going to interrupt your ability to have intimacy with other people. Again, nobody wants to be around somebody who's torturing themselves. And on the flip side, if you are staying resolute in that part of who you are and nobody's going to quote unquote disrupt your calm there, you might actually be ignoring opportunities of connection. And you just have to understand that everybody has their own introverted gig going on. And so if they're giving judgment or perceived judgment, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It can actually just be a reflection of what's happening for them in their introverted space.
Measurement. That's the word that came to me, kind of working that thought out earlier. And then as you were talking, measurement is tied to this because the should statements and the judging functions, basically we're measuring something. Like when we judge, we're judging hitting the mark or not hitting the mark. I'm overvaluing a binary of that, like yes or no, pass, fail. It could be a gradient too, but it's a measurement of sorts. And I think that's important to realize that whatever we set up as our measuring stick or as our ruler, that's going to inform how we judge things too. So judgment isn't equal. In other words, like we even talked about at the very beginning, I separated out as judgment for who I am versus what I am. Well, I had the measuring stick of who more than the what, right, in a lot of ways. So the measuring stick we pick or the measuring sticks that we use will inform the type of judgment we take into ourselves or that we give out to other people. And that's just something to think about. There's nothing necessarily to expand upon that, but just remember that the thing you're measuring, probably for yourself, is how you're going to measure other people. That's one thing to be aware of. And over time, you can probably be conditioned to measure yourself in the way other people measure themselves. And I think that happened to me. In my early life, it was more about who I was, but I would say that I've got a little bit more feedback from the world of this is how you should be measuring yourself. And I've adopted some of that. I've altered my measuring stick of my life based on external pressure to do so. So I think that awareness of me doing that, something I'm going to be thinking about, journaling about probably going forward, is like how did I absorb so much from the world out there to be judging myself? Because when I was younger, I used to move through the world much more freely, much less concerned about what people thought about me. And I'm much more concerned about that now, weirdly enough, as I get older. And it's something that I've really struggled with. Like, why do I care more what people think now? I didn't when I was 22. I mean, I would say and do all sorts of things. I'm like, geez, I can't believe I did those things back then when I was young. Maybe it's just youth. Maybe that's the thing. I don't know. But in some ways, I am trying to find myself back to that person because I kind of liked him a little bit more. I like the fact that he didn't allow external judgment to determine his behaviors or what he was going to do. He seemed more centered in himself. Weirdly enough, after all this personal growth, I look back at that guy who was less developed and I miss some aspects of him. And so I'm going to find ways to, in a developed way, bring some more of that back into my life going forward.
I think you like the liberated freedom, the liberated feel, but probably not the cavalier nature.
Yeah.
Because I think as you've developed, you've become more compassionate.
That's correct.
And that person younger did whatever they wanted to, and they also may have cracked quite a few eggs they didn't want to crack. And so now integrating the liberated part along with the compassion, which is not something the younger version of you had mastered.
That's totally true. And I think that compassion is very key to not do behaviors that are the quote-unquote right or approved of, but they're the compassionate, kind behaviors. And again, that's that measuring stick I'm talking about, right? I don't want to measure myself on what the society tells me I am supposed to do or not do. I want to measure myself on what is kind to other people and what gives joy and brings positivity. And that measuring stick is very nuanced because those seemingly are the same thing. You know, I get told that you've got to be this way. This is the kind way to be. And I'm like, I don't know if that's kind. I feel like my inner sense says that actually speaking truth in this situation and offending that person might actually be the kind thing to do. And sometimes that's hard to know the difference. Those measuring sticks are hard to really suss out in yourself. And I think as awareness, we build awareness as people and we have reference experiences. You know, we test things in the world and see how they respond or how people respond and how things work and how we feel about them or how others feel about them. I think these things can refine that over time.
Yeah, society gets it wrong all the time. I wouldn't use them always as a litmus test either for kindness because, again, we're surface level a lot of times and we have a tendency to prefer nice over kind because kindness is work and it creates conflict and you got to work through a bunch of stuff. To
go meta a little bit, I observed myself judging myself in this conversation a couple times. I'm getting pretty aware of that. And in not the last thing I said, but the thing right before that I was talking about, as I was speaking, I was like, does this just sound like I could hear my voice in my head going, does this sound just like personal growth advice that everybody in the world's heard already? Is this going to contribute or add value at all? Do I sound silly? Should I just stop talking? Like, is this going to be it's so pervasive. It runs in the background if you're not aware of it all the time. Like even in the middle of us talking about judgment, bringing full awareness to it, I just realized I was doing it to myself in the midst of this conversation.
And the question of, is this helpful, is a calibrative question. And the no, it's terrible, you should beat yourself up for it, is the critical inner voice judgment. I don't think there's anything wrong with the inner dialogue, that meta perspective, watching you perform, watching ourselves, watching me perform, and taking the temperature of how well I'm performing and doing, I think is a desire to be excellent. And the, oh God, you did it wrong, this is a terrible podcast because it's not perfect, I need to flagellate myself, is the judgment. That's the knife you swallow, you're on your own or yourself. So I think it's good to remember that a little bit of that is okay, just to keep quality control up, but there's no reason to undermine your sense of self or self-worth or value or self-esteem. And I think that's the challenge. But to piggyback on the idea of how hard it is to have conversations around judgment, there is somebody who's listening who feels judged by this podcast.
Sure.
And it's going to be triggering to them because they're going to think we're calling them judgmental because that's how they feel about themselves.
Well, it could be the person that sent you that email back listening, quite frankly.
Absolutely. Absolutely that person could feel judged. And I think that's the challenge with judgment is to get out of the cycle to begin with. It needs a pattern interrupt. It's not just awareness. It needs something that interrupts the pattern. Now, awareness is the first step to that. But I think what needs to happen is action going the other direction. And in INFx Empowered, pitching that one more time because it's actually a brilliant program. One of the recommendations that was made by a council member named Daniel is to have a journal, a gratitude journal that is he's constantly adding to his gratitude journal all the things he's grateful for, including himself, the things he loves about himself, the things that he's grateful and appreciative of. And so that neural pathway that gets so edged in needs to have dramatic, efforts put to reprogramming it. And some of those dramatic efforts is just going into that source code and removing the lines of script in there and replacing it with positive self-talk. And yeah, that might sound like personal development platitude, but it works. It actually works. Awareness of when you're doing it, thanking yourself for wanting to have high quality control, right? Because the beginning of that was the question, did I do okay? It's the answer of no, and you should beat yourself up for not having done it okay. That's the challenge. So when you hear yourself go meta in your own mind, am I doing okay here? Is this all right? And then saying, hey, voice, thank you. Thank you for that quality control attempt. I do want to be excellent. I appreciate it. And it's going to be okay if it's not perfect. And I'm so grateful to myself for fill in the blank. And I think taking proactive measures to reprogram your brain to judge yourself as worthy. Like the judgment is still there, but the evaluation is better. I think that's the direction we need to go.
I think that's an excellent point because when we say the word judgment in your mind listening right now, you automatically will think negative things. Like judgment, oh, that's negative. To judge yourself is negative. Well, it's not. You're judging. You're making a measure on the measuring stick. Why couldn't you judge and come out with a positive result of that judgment? Why do we associate the word judgment with the negative result of judgment and not the positive result of judgment? Because you're judging yourself on the positive things too, not just the negative things. We have this thing we do every night at dinner with our kids. It's something I think we've mentioned on the podcast or somewhere in one of the recordings we've been doing lately because we've been doing tons of recordings. I'm not sure where I said it. We do this thing called caught in the act because I know we're all judgmental as people. So we do this thing with our children at the dinner table where we say, who has a caught in the act today? And the caught in the act is to identify and judge somebody in the family for doing something right that day, judging other people for the positive things they did that day. And so we go around the table and our 7-year-old Piper loves it. She's the one that always raises her hand first and has tons of things for the whole family. She's very enthusiastic about it. Teenage boys are a little harder to get into this frame, but I'm working on it.
This is stupid, Dad. Why are we doing this?
But we're working on it, and it's something because it's kind of like it's like that Disney idea where people kept walking across the grass at Disneyland when it first opened, and the employees came to Walt Disney and said, "What do we do about this? How do we stop? We've tried a fence. They keep climbing the fence. They're walking over the grass." He's like, "Just pave over where they're walking." So we're judging ourselves anyway, and we're judging other people anyway. So what if we flip the script? What if we flipped it from seeing judgments as always looking for the negative, and maybe for a while just swing that pendulum over and only look for the positive when you're judging yourself and others? And what if you started to articulate that? What if you start catching people in the act at work, your employees? You just go up to Bob in the IT department and go, "Hey, Bob, I want to tell you I caught you doing something awesome today. I saw you help Susan over there with her computer when I knew you didn't have the time to do it because you had to go to a meeting, but you stopped and did that. I noticed that. That was amazing, man. I love that. That was cool. Keep that up." I mean, that's very similar to you going over to Bob and saying, "Hey, dude, that was not cool. You just cut that person off in line for the water fountain or whatever." I don't know if that's something somebody would say, but for the water cooler coming to my head first thing. That wasn't cool. Like, we're judging anyway, so why not bring the positive things? Articulate those to people.
You haven't worked in an office in a while, have you?
I haven't. I'm unemployable at this point.
That's right. We don't know how office politics work.
I would be the worst employee ever.
Yeah.
But I pretend to be a good one, but I would be a terrible one.
Probably. Yeah. Well, I think the Gunner 13-year-old, "Dad, this is stupid." There's a part of us, he knows he's being reprogrammed, by the way. His resistance is his brain is being reprogrammed for positive.
Yeah.
And so he's going to resist it, and he's going to get sulky, and he's going to be like, this is stupid. And eventually the reprogramming will have worked and he's going to be okay with it.
Hope so.
Well, I mean, that's our job as parents, is to try, right? We got to brainwash him somehow.
Well, I don't care if he's okay with it. I just hope the programming works.
Right. What I mean is he will be okay with it when the programming works.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a part of us that gets sulky when we're being reprogrammed. But just like as parents, it's our job to brainwash our kids. So let's brainwash them in the best way possible. It's also our job to brainwash ourselves. That's our job, right? What does Jack Kornfield say? That if we don't take control for programming our mind, the world will do it for us. And so that's our job. Our job is to program ourselves. And there's going to be a sulky 13-year-old that goes, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? And you just got to smile at that 13-year-old and go, we're doing it for our long-term, all of our collective long-term happiness. That's why. And you just keep going.
What's coming up for you? You've been listening along with us, and you've had judgment in your life for yourself, for others. Maybe you've struggled with it. Maybe you've found a way out. Maybe you're in recovery from the judgment of yourself, the negative judgment. Maybe you've rewired yourself to be very positively judging yourself and other people, and you're articulating that to yourself and others. What is coming up for you? What are your questions? What's your feedback? And we want to hear your story. What stories do you have around this in your life? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this podcast. You can leave those questions, comments, or your story.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you could subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for the podcast on iTunes, that's helpful. Our book is out. Go get yourself a copy at Amazon, Books A Million, retailers, etc. And if you leave a rating and review for the book on Amazon, that also helps us out a lot. And go check out our INFx Empowered program. It's a program that we put a lot of heart and soul into, and that has changed us. A lot of the reason why we're able to show up saying the things that we're saying is because we've been so impacted by it recently. So go check out INFx Empowered, particularly if you're an INFP or an INFJ, and see if the program's right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.